In the heart of a bustling city, millionaire Miguel Parker seemed to have it all: wealth, status, and an untouchable lifestyle. But on one fateful Christmas Eve, his perfectly crafted world crumbled. Stripped of his fortune and shrouded in solitude, Miguel found himself trapped in the cold emptiness of his lavish apartment. As laughter and warmth from a neighbor's holiday celebration seeped through the walls, a knock on his door would change everything. An unexpected visitor, a cheerful child with gingerbread cookies, opened a crack in Miguel's carefully guarded heart. Drawn reluctantly into a community he'd long ignored, Miguel embarked on a journey that would challenge his deepest beliefs and uncover a truth he'd never dared to face: what happens when a man who has everything loses it all, and discovers that what he truly needs can't be bought. The answer lies in a story of redemption, connection, and the transformative power of Christmas. Miguel Parker adjusted his cufflinks as he stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling window of his luxury apartment. The Dallas skyline stretched before him, its lights shimmering like the fortune he had meticulously built over decades. This view had always been a source of pride, a tangible reminder of his success. But tonight, it offered no solace. His phone, lying on the marble countertop, buzzed incessantly. Each vibration felt like a tremor, a prelude to the earthquake that had just shaken his world. Earlier that evening, Miguel had received a call from a firm handling an ongoing federal investigation. His accountant, a man he trusted implicitly, had been charged with embezzlement and financial fraud. The government had frozen all of the accountant's clients' accounts, including Miguel's. For the first time in years, his money, his shield, his power, was out of reach. The words from the investigator echoed in his mind: "Until the matter is resolved, all your assets will remain inaccessible." The finality of the statement hit him like a cold wind. Miguel walked over to the phone and glanced at the screen. Social media notifications, missed calls, and texts poured in faster than he could clear them. News of the scandal had spread rapidly. One headline in particular caught his eye: "Millionaire insurance mogul faces sudden financial freeze amid fraud investigation." His name, which once commanded respect and admiration, was now a trending topic, and not for reasons he could boast about. Comments from strangers, dripping with schadenfreude, scrolled past his eyes as he poured himself a glass of whiskey and sank into the leather armchair in the corner of his living room. The glow from the Christmas tree in the corner offered a warm contrast to the sterile white walls, but it only made him feel more out of place. He had bought the tree out of obligation, not sentiment, and had hired decorators to set it up. It stood there now as another symbol of his detached existence, polished, perfect, and devoid of meaning. As he sipped the whiskey, his thoughts raced. How had this happened? Miguel had always prided himself on being in control, orchestrating every aspect of his life with precision. His investments were diverse, his reputation solid. Yet, here he was, powerless to access even a fraction of his wealth. The realization was suffocating. He set the glass down, its clink against the table breaking the oppressive silence. In the distance, faint laughter filtered through the walls. Miguel turned his head toward the source of the sound. It came from the hallway, where his neighbors seemed to be gathering. He hadn't paid much attention to them before; they were background noise to his carefully curated life. Now, their voices carried an unfamiliar weight. He stood and walked to the door, hesitating before opening it slightly. The sight was unexpected. Residents were stringing lights along the railings and carrying trays of food to a table set up in the common area. Children ran around with glowing ornaments, their laughter sharp and carefree. An older woman hummed a Christmas tune as she adjusted a garland. It was a scene so ordinary yet alien to Miguel, who had spent every Christmas of the past decade in some exclusive resort or high-end restaurant. The juxtaposition of their joy against his frustration felt almost mocking. He shut the door quietly and leaned against it. His mind turned to the people outside. How could they be so content? Most of them probably earned a fraction of what he used to make in a month, yet they seemed genuinely happy. The idea unsettled him, a crack in the armor of his self-image. For years, Miguel had equated happiness with success, and success with wealth. Now, stripped of his fortune, he felt exposed, unsure of where he stood. His phone buzzed again, dragging him back to the present. This time, it was a call from one of his business partners. Miguel considered ignoring it but knew the silence would be worse. He answered with a curt, "What is it?" The voice on the other end was tense, barely hiding its irritation. "They're pulling out," the partner said bluntly. "The board thinks your involvement in this mess is too risky. We can't afford to be associated with you right now." Miguel clenched his jaw. "You know I had nothing to do with this," he said, his voice sharp. "Doesn't matter. Perception is reality, Miguel. You taught us that." The call ended abruptly, leaving Miguel holding the phone in stunned silence. It wasn't just his money he was losing, it was his status, his connections, his carefully built empire. He set the phone down and walked back to the window. The skyline looked different now, more distant, as if the city itself was pulling away from him, the weight of it all pressed down on him, a suffocating force he couldn't escape. He had spent his life building walls to keep others out, but now those walls felt like a prison. For the first time in years, Miguel Parker was truly alone. As the night wore on, the sounds from the hallway grew louder. The laughter and chatter grated against his nerves, a constant reminder of a world he had never allowed himself to be part of. He turned on the television, hoping for a distraction, but every channel seemed to carry a story about the investigation. His name flashed across the screen again and again, each mention like a dagger to his pride. Miguel turned off the television and sat in the darkness. The Christmas lights from the tree cast faint shadows on the walls, their twinkling rhythm almost mocking. He had always believed himself untouchable, a man above the chaos of ordinary life. But tonight, as the reality of his situation sank in, he realized how fragile his existence truly was. For the first time, Miguel considered what it might mean to lose everything, not just the money, but the identity he had built around it. The thought terrified him, and outside, the sounds of the celebration continued, a world away from the solitary man behind the locked door. Miguel woke to the dull hum of the air conditioner, the only sound in the vast, empty space of his apartment. The morning light filtered through the sheer curtains, casting soft patterns across the polished floor. He stared at the ceiling, his mind heavy with the events of the previous day. It was his first morning in years without the comfort of certainty, without the reassurance of his wealth providing a safety net. For the first time, he didn't know what came next. The kitchen felt colder than usual as he shuffled in, barefoot, and poured himself a cup of coffee. The machine, sleek and expensive, whirred mechanically, as indifferent to his predicament as the rest of the world seemed to be. He sipped the coffee slowly, letting the bitterness settle on his tongue. His phone lay on the counter, silent now, though he had turned off the notifications hours earlier. There was no point in reading more headlines or messages. They all carried the same theme: ridicule, disappointment, and scandal. The silence in the apartment was oppressive. Every small noise, the creak of the chair as he sat, the soft clink of his cup on the table, felt amplified. Miguel's thoughts filled the void, replaying the phone call with his business partner, the mocking headlines, and the laughter in the hallway from the night before. That laughter seemed to haunt him, its warmth a sharp contrast to the coldness of his isolation. He wandered into the living room and stood before the Christmas tree. The lights blinked rhythmically, casting a soft glow on the carefully chosen ornaments. It was a designer's masterpiece, not a personal creation. Miguel hadn't touched a single decoration. He didn't even know where they'd come from. The tree, like everything else in his life, had been outsourced, curated for perfection but devoid of meaning. Now, it stood as a silent witness to his unraveling. Outside, the city was alive. He could hear faint traces of traffic and the occasional honk of a horn. The world was moving forward, oblivious to his struggles. Miguel moved to the window, looking down at the streets below. People hurried along the sidewalks, bundled against the crisp December air, their arms full of shopping bags and wrapped gifts. The sight felt alien to him. He couldn't remember the last time he had walked among them, the ordinary people he once dismissed as background to his carefully orchestrated life. As the day stretched on, Miguel avoided his phone and email. He couldn't bring himself to face the fallout. He knew his staff, his clients, and even distant acquaintances were waiting for answers he didn't have. Instead, he retreated further into himself, pacing the apartment like a caged animal. By late afternoon, hunger forced him to address his new reality. Miguel opened the refrigerator, expecting to find it fully stocked as it always had been. But the shelves were nearly empty, save for a few bottles of water, some condiments, and a carton of eggs. He frowned, realizing that his personal assistant, who usually handled his groceries, had likely stopped deliveries after the scandal broke. With no desire to cook, he considered ordering food. His usual go-to restaurants flashed through his mind, but a sinking realization stopped him. His credit cards were frozen, just like his accounts. The indignity of it hit him hard. He couldn't even order a simple meal. Miguel clenched his fists and closed the refrigerator door with more force than necessary. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the apartment. The hours crawled by, each one heavier than the last. As evening approached, the faint sounds of activity began to filter through the walls again. He heard footsteps, the muffled thump of something heavy being set down, and bursts of laughter. The sounds grew louder and more frequent, breaking the stillness of his solitude. Miguel moved to the door and pressed his ear against it. He could hear voices now, clear and unguarded. "Pass me the tape." "This banner isn't going to hang itself," a woman's voice called out, followed by a chorus of laughter. "Do you think we have enough cookies?" another voice asked, deeper and full of warmth. Miguel's curiosity got the better of him, and he cracked the door open, peering out into the hallway. What he saw startled him. The neighbors were transforming the sterile corridor into a festive space. Strings of lights crisscrossed the ceiling, and garlands hung from the railings. A large table was being set up in the middle of the hallway, already laden with trays of food. Children darted around, their laughter filling the air. He watched as they worked together, their movements fluid and collaborative. It was a far cry from the structured and competitive world Miguel had inhabited for so long. These people seemed happy, genuinely so, despite the modesty of their surroundings. It was a sight Miguel didn't know how to process. He had spent his life building walls, literal and metaphorical, to separate himself from the world. Now, watching this small community come together, he felt an unfamiliar pang of envy. A child, no older than 6, noticed him standing in the doorway and waved. Miguel hesitated, unsure of how to respond. The child didn't wait for a reaction and ran off, giggling as they joined the others. Miguel shut the door quickly, his heart racing. He wasn't used to being seen, not like this. Vulnerable, stripped of his armor, he felt exposed. Back inside, he leaned against the door, his breathing uneven. The warmth and connection he had glimpsed in the hallway felt like a rebuke to his carefully crafted life. He moved back to the living room, sitting heavily on the couch. The sounds from the hallway continued, growing louder as more neighbors arrived. Miguel tried to block it out, turning on the television and flipping through channels. But every station seemed to carry a story about the fraud investigation. His name scrolled across the bottom of the screen, a stark reminder of his public disgrace. He turned the TV off and sat in silence, the noise from the hallway seeping in around him. As the evening wore on, Miguel found himself drawn back to the door. He cracked it open again, just enough to see without being seen. The table in the hallway was now surrounded by people, plates in hand, as they chatted and laughed. Someone strummed a guitar, their voice joining the hum of conversation in a makeshift carol. Miguel closed the door once more, this time with a deep sigh. The weight of his solitude pressed down on him. For years, he had convinced himself that he didn't need anyone, that his success was enough to fill the void. But tonight, as the sounds of connection and joy filled the air, he couldn't ignore the truth. His empire had crumbled, and with it, the illusion of self-sufficiency. He sat in the quiet of his apartment, the laughter and music from the hallway a stark contrast to the silence that enveloped him. For the first time in years, Miguel felt the full weight of his isolation, and it terrified him. Miguel sat in his darkened apartment, the faint hum of the festivities in the hallway serving as an unwelcome reminder of his solitude. The sounds of laughter, conversation, and clinking dishes filtered through the walls, growing louder as the evening stretched on. He had tried to drown it out by flipping through channels on the television, but each news segment brought another story about his frozen accounts and public embarrassment. Eventually, he had turned the TV off, leaving the apartment cloaked in an oppressive silence interrupted only by the muffled merriment outside that he had never felt so unmoored. The collapse of his financial empire had shaken him to his core, exposing the hollowness of his carefully constructed life. For years, he had prided himself on his independence, his ability to thrive without relying on anyone. Yet now, as he sat alone, he couldn't help but feel the sting of being truly isolated. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Miguel froze, his heart pounding unexpectedly in the stillness. He wasn't expecting anyone. For a brief moment, he considered ignoring it, hoping whoever it was would simply go away. But the knock came again, gentle but insistent. Curiosity and irritation warred within him as he got up and approached the door. Through the peephole, he could see a child, no older than 6 or 7, standing in the dimly lit hallway. She wore a red sweater with a Christmas tree embroidered on it, and in her hands was a small tray covered with a paper napkin. Miguel hesitated, unsure of what to do. The idea of opening the door felt foreign. He rarely interacted with anyone in the building. Still, something about the child's presence, the quiet confidence in her knock, the unguarded warmth in her expression, compelled him to turn the lock and pull the door open slightly. The girl beamed up at him. "Hi," she said, her voice bright and unself-conscious. "I'm Emma. We live downstairs." She held the tray up toward him. "I brought you some cookies. My mom made them, but I helped. They're gingerbread." Miguel stared at her, caught off guard. It had been years since anyone had brought him anything homemade, let alone a gift so simple and unassuming. He glanced down at the tray, the scent of freshly baked gingerbread wafting up to meet him. "Thank you," he said stiffly, taking the tray from her hands. Emma didn't seem bothered by his lack of enthusiasm. She rocked back on her heels, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Are you coming to the party?" she asked. "It's really fun. We have lots of food, and Mr. Carter brought his guitar. He's playing Christmas songs. Everyone's there." Miguel shifted uncomfortably. "I don't think so," he said. "I'm busy." Emma tilted her head, unconvinced. "You don't look busy." Her blunt observation caught him off guard, and he couldn't suppress a wry smile. "Well, I am," he insisted, though his tone lacked conviction. Emma's gaze didn't waver. "You should come anyway," she said simply. "It's Christmas Eve. You're supposed to be with other people." Her words, delivered with the matter-of-factness only a child could manage, struck a nerve. Miguel had spent every Christmas of the past decade surrounded by people, at exclusive resorts, lavish parties, or high-end restaurants. But as he stood in the doorway of his apartment, holding a tray of cookies from a little girl he had never met, he realized that he had never truly been with anyone. "Not in the way Emma meant." "I'll think about it," he said finally. Emma grinned, satisfied with his answer. "Okay. But don't wait too long, or you'll miss the good stuff." With that, she turned and skipped down the hallway, disappearing around the corner. Miguel closed the door and leaned against it, the tray of cookies still in his hands. He stared at them for a long moment before setting them down on the counter. The apartment felt different now, as though Emma's visit had shifted something intangible. Her innocence and openness had stirred feelings he wasn't prepared to confront. That he paced the living room, glancing intermittently at the door. The noise from the hallway continued, growing louder as more people joined the festivities. He could hear snippets of music and bursts of laughter, the sounds of a community coming together. Against his better judgment, Miguel found himself drawn back to the door. He cracked it open, just enough to see into the hallway. The scene was almost surreal. A long table stretched down the corridor, covered with dishes of every kind, casseroles, pies, trays of cookies, and bowls of punch. String lights cast a warm glow over the gathering, and the garlands along the railings swayed gently as people moved past them. Emma was right, everyone seemed to be there. Neighbors of all ages mingled, their faces lit with genuine joy. Miguel spotted the man she had called Mr. Carter strumming a guitar, his voice leading the group in a spirited rendition of Jingle Bells. Children darted between the adults, their laughter ringing out like bells. Miguel felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name, envy, perhaps, or regret. He had spent so many years dismissing these people, seeing them as mere shadows in the background of his life. Yet here they were, creating something beautiful and real. While he stood alone behind a closed door, his thoughts were interrupted by another knock, this time louder and more deliberate. He opened the door to find an older woman standing there, holding a plate piled high with food. She smiled kindly. "Hi there," she said. "I'm Mrs. Alvarez. Emma told me you might need some dinner." She extended the plate toward him. "Come join us when you're ready. There's plenty to go around." Miguel hesitated, his pride warring with the unfamiliar warmth he felt in her gesture. "Thank you," he said softly, taking the plate. Mrs. Alvarez patted his arm. "No need to thank me, dear. That's what neighbors are for." She gave him one last smile before returning to the gathering. Miguel closed the door again, but this time, the silence didn't feel as oppressive. He set the plate down next to the tray of cookies and stared at the two offerings. For years, he had surrounded himself with luxury, but none of it had ever felt as meaningful as these simple acts of kindness. That he sat down at the table, picking up a fork and taking a bite of the food Mrs. Alvarez had brought. It was warm and hearty, the kind of meal that filled more than just the stomach. As he ate, he found himself listening to the sounds of the hallway, not with resentment, but with something closer to longing. Emma's words echoed in his mind, "You're supposed to be with other people." For the first time, Miguel wondered what it might feel like to belong to something greater than himself. As the evening wore on, he remained at the table, the door to his apartment still ajar. The distant sounds of the celebration drifted in, and for the first time in years, Miguel felt something shift within him, a small but undeniable crack in the walls he had built around his heart. Miguel stood in his doorway, staring at the hallway-turned holiday celebration. The gentle hum of conversation, the sound of a guitar strumming a familiar Christmas melody, and the bursts of laughter made the scene feel alive in a way Miguel hadn't experienced in years. The plate of food Mrs. Alvarez had brought sat empty on his kitchen counter, and the scent of gingerbread cookies lingered faintly in the air. Emma's bright smile and kind invitation replayed in his mind, tugging at something he didn't fully understand. For several minutes, he debated with himself. Going to the party felt foreign, even absurd. These people were strangers to him, neighbors, yes, but not ones he'd ever bothered to know. His pride reminded him that stepping out there meant being vulnerable, an unfamiliar and uncomfortable territory. But another voice, quieter but insistent, whispered that he had nothing left to lose. Eventually, he found himself reaching for his jacket. The act felt reluctant, almost involuntary. He hesitated once more at the door, his hand resting on the frame as he took a deep breath. Then, before he could talk himself out of it, Miguel stepped into the hallway. The air was warmer here, filled with the mingling scents of spiced cider, baked goods, and roasted meats. He kept his movements deliberate, almost mechanical, as he approached the gathering. Heads turned as he entered, the shift in conversation subtle but noticeable. It was clear that Miguel's presence was unexpected. Emma was the first to notice him. Her eyes lit up, and she dashed over, tugging on his sleeve. "You came," she exclaimed, her voice brimming with excitement. "I told you it would be fun." Miguel forced a small smile, though it felt awkward on his face. "I couldn't miss the good stuff, right?" he said, his voice betraying a trace of self-consciousness. Emma grinned and pulled him further into the crowd. "Come on, you have to meet everyone." The introduction process was chaotic but strangely endearing. Emma led him from person to person, rattling off names and bits of information with the energy of a tour guide. Miguel nodded politely, struggling to remember the details. "This is Mr. Carter," Emma said, stopping in front of a man holding a guitar. He looked to be in his late 50s, with a salt and pepper beard and a warm smile. He's the one playing all the songs. Mr. Carter extended a hand, which Miguel shook hesitantly. Nice to see you out here, he said. We've been wondering if you'd ever show up to one of these. Miguel offered a faint smile. Well, tonight seemed different. Mr. Carter chuckled. Different is one word for it. Welcome to the party. The introductions continued, each interaction leaving Miguel feeling more disoriented. He met young couples, retired professionals, and families with children, all of them offering polite greetings or warm smiles. Some looked at him with curiosity, clearly aware of his reputation as the reclusive, untouchable resident of the building. Others seemed genuinely pleased to see him, their kindness catching him off guard. Mrs. Alvarez approached with a plate in hand, her earlier warmth undiminished. Miguel, dear, you have to try the tamales, she said, pressing the plate into his hands. They're my abuela's recipe. Best you'll ever taste. He accepted the plate with a nod of thanks, his polite facade starting to crack under the onslaught of such sincere generosity. He couldn't remember the last time someone had offered him something without expecting anything in return. As he stood there, awkwardly holding the plate of tamales, a man in his 30s approached. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a firm handshake and an easy demeanor. Name's Chris, he said. I live across the hall from you. We've passed each other a dozen times, but I don't think we've ever really talked. Miguel nodded. That sounds about right. I tend to keep to myself. Chris smirked. Yeah, we noticed. But hey, better late than never, right? Before Miguel could respond, Emma appeared again, tugging at his sleeve. They're starting a game. You should play. Miguel blinked. A game? Charades. Emma said enthusiastically. It's so fun. Come on. Before he could protest, she was leading him toward a circle of people. The group made room for him, and Miguel found himself standing awkwardly among them. The game had already begun, and the energy was infectious. Laughter filled the air as people guessed wildly, their enthusiasm overshadowing their accuracy. When it was Miguel's turn, he hesitated. The group looked at him expectantly, and for a moment, he considered backing out. But Emma's encouraging smile gave him just enough courage to take the stage. The clue he was handed read, Santa Claus. He fumbled at first, unsure of how to convey the image without words. But as the group began shouting guesses, some wildly off base, he found himself loosening up. By the time someone correctly guessed Santa Claus, Miguel was laughing despite himself, the tension in his chest easing for the first time in days. The evening wore on, and Miguel found himself drawn into more conversations. A retired teacher shared stories about her years in the classroom. A young couple talked about their dream of opening a bakery. Even the children, buzzing with energy, came to him with tales of their school plays and holiday wishes. It wasn't long before Miguel noticed something he hadn't expected. These people weren't trying to impress him. They weren't networking or posturing for status. They were simply sharing themselves, their stories and experiences offered freely and without pretense. It was disarming, and for the first time, Miguel felt the weight of his own defenses. As the party began to wind down, Miguel found himself standing near the table, a cup of spiced cider in hand. Mr. Carter approached, his guitar slung over his shoulder. You held your own tonight, he said with a grin. Miguel chuckled softly. I'm not sure about that, but it was good to get out. Mr. Carter nodded. It's never too late to join the party, Miguel. You'd be surprised what you can find when you stop standing on the sidelines. The words lingered with him as the crowd began to disperse, neighbors exchanging hugs and well wishes before retreating to their apartments. Miguel stayed behind for a moment, watching as the lights were dimmed and the last of the dishes were cleared away. As he made his way back to his own apartment, the hallway felt different. The decorations still hung on the walls, but the air carried a new warmth. For the first time, Miguel didn't feel like an outsider looking in. He closed his door behind him and leaned against it, the quiet of his apartment no longer as heavy as it had been. The tray of cookies still sat on the counter, untouched, but now they seemed less like an offering from a stranger and more like a symbol of connection. Miguel sat down at the table, his mind replaying the events of the evening. The laughter, the stories, the easy camaraderie, it all felt so unfamiliar, yet so strangely comforting. For the first time in years, he felt something stir within him, a faint but undeniable sense of belonging. The party had dwindled, the last of the neighbors retreating to their apartments as the hallway grew quieter. The only remnants of the celebration were the faint smell of spiced cider and the strings of twinkling lights still draped along the railings. Miguel, however, remained at the makeshift gathering space, lingering in the glow of an evening unlike any he'd ever experienced. For someone who had spent years mastering the art of detachment, the events of the night had left him strangely unmoored. He glanced down at the empty cup in his hand before setting it on the table. Around him, a few of the more committed revelers were still chatting. Mrs. Alvarez, ever the matronly figure, was wrapping up leftover tamales to hand out to anyone who would take them. Chris leaned against the wall, laughing at something one of the younger neighbors had said. The atmosphere was relaxed, unguarded, a stark contrast to the polished and calculated social gatherings Miguel had once frequented. "You're still here." The voice startled Miguel, and he turned to find Mr. Carter approaching with a warm smile, his guitar case slung over one shoulder. Miguel offered a faint smile of his own. "I guess I am." Mr. Carter gestured to an empty chair near the table. "Mind if I sit?" Miguel shook his head. "Not at all." The older man settled into the chair with a contented sigh, setting the guitar case down beside him. For a moment, neither spoke, the quiet between them filled with the faint hum of the remaining voices and the occasional creak of the building's heating system. "You seem to loosen up tonight," Mr. Carter said finally, his tone casual but observant. Miguel chuckled softly, the sound tinged with self-awareness. "I suppose I did. It's been a long time since I've been part of something like this." "Part of something," Mr. Carter repeated, nodding. "That's the key, isn't it? Feeling like you're part of something bigger than yourself." Miguel stared down at the table, his fingers idly tracing the grain of the wood. The truth of those words hung in the air, undeniable yet difficult to confront. He had spent so much of his life building a fortress around himself, convinced that independence was the ultimate goal. And yet, tonight, that fortress had felt more like a prison. "I don't think I've ever been good at that," Miguel admitted after a pause. "Being part of something. I've always kept people at arm's length. It seemed safer that way." Mr. Carter tilted his head, studying Miguel thoughtfully. "Safer, sure. But is it better?" Miguel opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. He wasn't sure how to answer that. At that moment, Mrs. Alvarez approached, carrying a plate of tamales wrapped neatly in foil. She set them down in front of Miguel with a firm smile. "For you," she said. "You'll need something to eat tomorrow." Miguel blinked, momentarily taken aback by her thoughtfulness. "Thank you," he said softly. Mrs. Alvarez patted his arm. "You're welcome, dear. And don't be a stranger. We're all in this together, whether you realize it or not." As she walked away, Miguel found himself staring at the plate, the weight of her words settling heavily on his shoulders. He glanced back at Mr. Carter, who was watching him with quiet amusement. "You've made quite the impression tonight," Mr. Carter said. "I'm not sure why," Miguel admitted. "I've been here for years, but I've never been part of this." Mr. Carter leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes people just need a chance to see the real you. And sometimes, you need a chance to show it." The word struck a chord, and Miguel felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to say more, to unburden himself of the thoughts and emotions that had been building inside him since the moment his carefully constructed life had crumbled. "I've spent so much time building walls," he said, his voice quieter now. "I thought if I kept everything under control, if I worked hard enough, made enough money, achieved enough success, that it would be enough. That I wouldn't need anything else. Mr. Carter nodded but said nothing, allowing Miguel to continue. But now I'm not sure I even know what success means, Miguel admitted. My life was all about business deals and status, but I don't think I've ever really been happy. I don't think I've ever let myself be. The confession hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. For a man who had spent his entire adult life projecting an image of control and invulnerability, the act of admitting his vulnerabilities felt both terrifying and liberating. Carter smiled gently. You're not the first person to feel that way, you know. A lot of us have been there, working so hard to get ahead that we forget what we're leaving behind. Miguel looked up, meeting the older man's gaze. And what do you do when you realize that? When you realize you've been chasing the wrong things? Mr. Carter chuckled softly. You start by forgiving yourself. Then you figure out what really matters, and you go after that instead. The simplicity of the answer caught Miguel off guard. He had spent years complicating his life, chasing after goals that never seemed to bring him the satisfaction he thought they would. The idea of starting over, of finding something more meaningful, felt almost impossible. But it also felt necessary. Before he could respond, Emma appeared again, her boundless energy undiminished. We're doing one last song before we go, she announced, tugging at Miguel's sleeve. You have to come. Miguel hesitated, glancing at Mr. Carter, who gave him an encouraging nod. Go on, the older man said. It's good for the soul. With a reluctant smile, Miguel allowed Emma to pull him toward the small circle that had gathered near the railing. Mr. Carter followed, picking up his guitar as he joined the group. The final song was a familiar one, Silent Night. Mr. Carter strummed the chords gently, his voice leading the group in a rendition that was both simple and heartfelt. Miguel stood at the edge of the circle, his voice quiet at first but gradually growing stronger as he allowed himself to be part of the moment. As the last notes faded into the stillness of the night, Miguel felt a warmth he couldn't quite explain. It wasn't the forced camaraderie of a business dinner or the shallow pleasantries of a networking event. It was something real, something genuine. For the first time in years, Miguel felt like he belonged. The hallway was quiet again, but Miguel lingered by the festive decorations, his gaze fixed on the string lights overhead as they twinkled softly. Most of the neighbors had gone back to their apartments, but a small group still gathered near the long table, chatting and laughing as they helped clean up the remains of the evening. Miguel hesitated. The thought of retreating to his empty apartment felt heavier now, like a return to the solitude he no longer wanted to face. Chris, the neighbor who had introduced himself earlier, caught Miguel's eye and waved him over. We're just wrapping up, Chris said with an easy smile. Come sit for a bit. No rush to head back, right? Miguel nodded, almost grateful for the invitation. He made his way over and joined them at the table, where the remnants of the evening's feast still lay, a nearly empty punch bowl, a few tamales, and a plate of broken gingerbread cookies. Mrs. Alvarez handed him a cup of tea without asking, and he accepted it with a quiet, thank you. The conversation drifted effortlessly between topics, from light-hearted jokes about who had the best tamale recipe to more personal reflections on the holiday season. Miguel listened more than he spoke, his guarded demeanor slowly giving way as the warmth of the group drew him in. I'll tell you this, Mrs. Alvarez said, leaning back in her chair. When I first moved here, I didn't know a soul. My husband had just passed away, and I felt like I'd lost my whole world. But this place, these people, they saved me. They made me feel like I wasn't alone. Her words hung in the air, resonating deeply with Miguel. She looked over at him, her kind eyes searching his face. You've been here a long time, haven't you? Miguel nodded. Several years. And yet tonight is the first time you've joined us, she said gently, though there was no judgment in her tone. He hesitated before answering. I suppose I thought I didn't need anyone. That I was better off keeping to myself. Chris chuckled. Yeah, we kind of got that impression. But hey, no hard feelings. We all have our walls. A younger woman, sitting to Miguel's right, chimed in. I used to think like that, too. I moved here after losing my job in Austin. I was so embarrassed about it, I didn't want to talk to anyone. But then Mrs. Alvarez knocked on my door one day with a plate of cookies, and, well, here I am. Miguel glanced at Mrs. Alvarez, who gave him a knowing smile. Cookies are a good icebreaker, she said. The group laughed, and Miguel found himself smiling despite the weight still pressing on his chest. The conversation shifted again, this time to Chris, who began recounting his own challenges. When I first got divorced, he said, his tone quieter now, I thought my life was over. Losing the house, splitting time with the kids, it felt like everything was falling apart. Moving here was a fresh start, but I'll be honest, I wasn't sure it would work out. He looked around the table, his gaze lingering on each of them. But this place, this community, it's the reason I got through it. I didn't realize how much I needed people until they showed up for me. Miguel listened intently, struck by the honesty of Chris's words. There was no pretense, no attempt to gloss over the pain. It was a raw, genuine reflection of resilience, and it stirred something within him. Didn't think I'd be sharing my sob story tonight, Chris added with a sheepish grin, breaking the tension with a bit of humor. You call that a sob story? Mr. Carter interjected, his voice warm and teasing. I've got you beat by a mile. The group laughed again, and Mr. Carter launched into a tale about his years as a struggling musician, traveling from city to city with little more than his guitar and a duffel bag. It wasn't glamorous, let me tell you, he said. But those tough times taught me a lot about what really matters. It's not the big breaks or the flashy gigs. It's the people you meet along the way, the ones who remind you you're not alone. As the stories continued, Miguel found himself reflecting on his own life. He had spent so many years chasing success, convinced that it would bring him fulfillment. But as he listened to his neighbors share their struggles and triumphs, he realized how narrow his definition of success had been. These people had faced hardships he could scarcely imagine, yet they had found strength in each other. In the simple act of coming together, the tea in his cup had gone cold, but Miguel barely noticed. He was too absorbed in the conversation, the warmth of the group, the unexpected sense of connection that had begun to take root within him. Finally, someone asked the question he had been dreading and perhaps hoping for all night. What about you, Miguel? Chris said. What's your story? All eyes turned to him, and for a moment, he felt the familiar urge to retreat, to deflect or dismiss the question. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the kindness in their expressions, the lack of judgment, or the realization that this was a rare opportunity to be seen, not as the image he had spent years projecting, but as the man he truly was. I don't know where to start, Miguel said, his voice quieter than usual. Start anywhere, Mrs. Alvarez said gently. He took a deep breath, then began to speak. He told them about his rise in the insurance world, the relentless drive that had fueled his success but left little room for anything else. He admitted how he had distanced himself from others, convinced that self-reliance was the key to happiness. And then, haltingly at first but with growing confidence, he shared what had happened recently, the frozen accounts, the scandal, the sudden collapse of the life he had so carefully built. I thought I had everything under control, he said, his voice breaking slightly. But now I don't know what I have. The group listened in silence, their faces etched with empathy. When he finished, there was a moment of stillness, as if the weight of his words hung in the air. Finally, Mrs. Alvarez reached across the table and placed a hand on his. You have us, she said simply. Miguel looked around the table, his throat tightening. It wasn't the kind of answer he had expected, but it was exactly what he needed to hear. One by one, the others spoke up, offering words of encouragement, sharing their own stories of loss and recovery, reminding him that he wasn't as alone as he had always believed. By the time the gathering broke up, Miguel felt something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of hope. It was fragile, tentative, but it was there, like the first light of dawn breaking through the darkness. As he returned to his apartment, he carried more than just the plate of tamales Mrs. Alvarez had insisted he take. He carried the knowledge that, despite everything he had lost, there was still something worth holding on to, a connection, a community, a chance to rebuild not just his life, but himself. The next morning, Miguel woke earlier than usual, the soft winter light filtering through the windows of his apartment. For the first time in a long while, the silence didn't feel oppressive. Instead, it carried a strange sense of peace. He lay there for a few moments, replaying the events of the previous night in his mind. The faces, the stories, the laughter, it all felt surreal, like a dream he wasn't ready to wake from. He finally rose, moving through his apartment with a sluggishness that came not from exhaustion but contemplation. The plate of tamales Mrs. Alvarez had given him sat on the counter, its foil wrapping glinting in the morning light. He unwrapped one, reheated it, and ate slowly, savoring the homemade taste. It was simple, but it was warm, comforting, so unlike the bland, detached meals he had grown used to ordering from high-end restaurants. After breakfast, Miguel found himself drawn to the window. The city below was alive with its usual hum of activity, but his eyes drifted instead to the courtyard of the building. From his vantage point, he could see some of the neighbors he'd spent the evening with. Chris was outside, tossing a ball back and forth with a young boy Miguel assumed was his son. Mrs. Alvarez was seated on a bench nearby, chatting animatedly with another resident as she knitted. For years, Miguel had barely noticed the people around him. They had been shadows in his peripheral vision, insignificant against the backdrop of his busy, self-contained life. But now, as he watched them interact, he felt a pang of something unfamiliar, longing, perhaps, or regret for all the time he had spent keeping himself separate. Without thinking, Miguel stepped away from the window, grabbed his coat, and headed for the door. He didn't have a clear plan or purpose, only the vague urge to be among them. As he walked through the hallway, he noticed the remnants of the previous night's celebration still hanging, garlands draped over the railings, a few stray crumbs on the table where the food had been served. He stepped outside into the crisp December air. The cold bit at his cheeks, but he barely noticed. Chris spotted him first, giving him a wave and a grin. "Morning," he called out. Miguel raised a hand in return, though he felt a bit awkward. "Morning." Chris jogged over, the boy trailing behind him. "This is my son, Jake," he said, ruffling the boy's hair. "Jake, this is Mr. Parker. He's our neighbor." "Hi," Jake said shyly, clutching the ball to his chest. Miguel nodded, offering a small smile. "Nice to meet you, Jake. You play ball?" Chris asked, gesturing to the ball in Jake's hands. Miguel hesitated. "It's been a while." "Perfect," Chris said with a grin, tossing the ball to him. "No better time to start again." Miguel caught it reflexively, his movements a bit stiff. He hadn't played anything resembling a game in years, but as Jake ran a few paces away, Miguel found himself throwing the ball back. It wasn't long before they settled into a rhythm, the simple act of playing easing the tension he hadn't realized he was carrying. As the game continued, more neighbors began to gather. Mrs. Alvarez came over, still knitting, and offered him an approving nod. A young couple from the building stopped by to chat, their toddler toddling after Jake. Before long, Miguel found himself in the center of a small but lively group, their chatter and laughter filling the courtyard. At some point, Miguel found himself sitting on the bench beside Mrs. Alvarez, watching as the others played and talked. She set her knitting aside and looked at him with a knowing smile. "You look different today," she said. Miguel glanced at her, his brow furrowing. "Different how?" "Lighter," she said simply. "Like you've set something down." Miguel considered her words, letting them settle. She wasn't wrong. For years, he had carried the weight of his ambition, his isolation, and his carefully maintained image. Letting go, even just a little, felt strangely liberating. "I think I'm starting to see things differently," he admitted. Mrs. Alvarez nodded, her hands folding neatly in her lap. "It's amazing what can happen when you open your door," she said. Literally and figuratively. The conversation drifted to other topics, and Miguel listened as she talked about her family, her late husband, and the years she had spent building a new life in this building. Her resilience was evident, her strength a quiet but powerful presence. The rest of the day passed in a blur of small but meaningful interactions. Miguel helped carry groceries for a neighbor who had her hands full, chatted with the young couple about their plans for the holidays, and even joined Chris for a cup of coffee in his apartment. Each moment felt like a small step towards something he couldn't quite define but knew he wanted more of. By the time evening came, Miguel felt an unfamiliar sense of contentment. His apartment, though still quiet, no longer felt as lonely. He sat by the window, sipping a cup of tea, and watched as the lights of the city twinkled against the dark sky. The memories of the past few days played in his mind, the frozen accounts, the humiliating headlines, the collapse of the life he had built. But for the first time, he didn't feel consumed by anger or regret. Instead, he felt a growing sense of possibility. His thoughts turned to the neighbors who had welcomed him so easily, despite his years of distance. They had shared their stories, their struggles, and their kindness, offering him a glimpse of a life he hadn't allowed himself to consider. As he sat there, Miguel realized something profound: his wealth, his success, his carefully constructed image, they had never been the source of his happiness. The moments that had brought him the most joy were the simplest ones, shared with others who had faced their own battles and come out stronger. For the first time, Miguel began to see the cracks in the walls he had built around himself not as flaws, but as openings. Openings for connection, for growth, for something more meaningful than the isolated existence he had once thought was enough. And as he looked out at the city below, the lights blending into the night, Miguel made a quiet promise to himself. He would let those cracks grow. He would allow himself to be vulnerable, to be part of something greater than himself, because for the first time in years, Miguel felt hope. And he wasn't ready to let it go. Miguel awoke to a soft vibration on the nightstand, the familiar buzz of his phone. For weeks, that sound had been a harbinger of bad news: reporters seeking statements, lawyers discussing frozen accounts, and business partners distancing themselves from his tarnished reputation. But today, something felt different. He reached for the phone and squinted at the screen. It was a text from his attorney: "Good news. The accounts have been unfrozen. Call me when you're ready to discuss next steps." Miguel sat up, rereading the message to make sure he hadn't misunderstood. The implications were enormous. His financial assets, his investments, his savings, his meticulously built safety net, were his again. Relief washed over him, but it wasn't the overwhelming rush of victory he might have expected. Instead, it felt measured, tempered by everything he'd experienced in the past few days. The Miguel of a month ago would have leapt out of bed, immediately diving into damage control and financial recovery plans. But today, he simply stared at the message, his mind lingering on the warmth of the prior evening's connections. After a moment, he called his attorney. The conversation was brisk and efficient. The fraud investigation into his accountant had concluded, revealing that Miguel had been nothing more than an unwitting victim. His accounts were reinstated, and his financial life, at least on paper, was back to normal. His attorney advised caution: there was still work to be done to repair his public image, but overall, the news was good. When the call ended, Miguel placed the phone on the table and exhaled deeply. The relief was real, but so was the awareness that this was only part of the equation. His financial security had returned, but he now understood that wealth alone wasn't enough. He got up and went to the kitchen, making himself a cup of coffee. As he sipped it, he looked around his apartment. The space, once a sanctuary of isolation, now felt like a blank canvas. For the first time, Miguel saw it not as a retreat from the world, but as a place that could be reshaped into something more meaningful. His thoughts turned to the people who had welcomed him so openly: Emma's bright smile, Mrs. Alvarez's wisdom, Chris's quiet strength. Their kindness had shown him a side of life he had long ignored. He knew he couldn't return to his old ways, not after everything he had experienced. As he finished his coffee, an idea began to form in his mind. Later that day, Miguel found himself sitting at his dining table, a notebook in front of him. He hadn't written anything by hand in years. His life had been ruled by emails and typed contracts, but this felt different. More intentional. He started by jotting down the needs he had noticed in the building. The communal spaces were functional but outdated. The courtyard could use better seating and more greenery. The children lacked a proper play area. He thought about the stories his neighbors had shared, stories of financial struggles and resilience, and began sketching ideas for how he could help. By the time he looked up, the afternoon sunlight was streaming through the windows. The notebook was filled with notes, diagrams, and plans. Miguel felt a renewed sense of purpose, one that went beyond rebuilding his reputation or regaining his social standing. This time, it wasn't about him. The next morning, Miguel approached the building's management office with his proposals. He had spent hours refining his ideas, calculating costs, and preparing a presentation. The manager, a pragmatic woman named Sarah, listened attentively as Miguel explained his vision. "I want to fund a complete renovation of the building's common areas," Miguel said, sliding a folder of sketches across the desk. "New furniture for the lounge, upgraded landscaping for the courtyard, and a safe, modern playground for the kids. I'll cover the expenses." Sarah raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "That's generous," she said cautiously. "But what's the catch?" "No catch," Miguel said, his voice steady. "This place has given me more than I realized. It's time I gave something back." Sarah studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right. Let's make it happen." Word spread quickly through the building. At first, Miguel was met with skepticism. For years, he had been the aloof resident who barely acknowledged anyone, and his sudden generosity raised questions. But as the renovations began, the doubt started to fade. Miguel was actively involved in the process, overseeing the installation of new benches and picnic tables in the courtyard, selecting plants for the landscaping, and even helping with the assembly of playground equipment. His neighbors, initially wary, began to approach him with curiosity and gratitude. Emma was thrilled about the playground. She followed Miguel around as he worked, peppering him with questions and offering her opinions on everything from the color of the slides to the placement of the swings. "You're like Santa Claus," she declared one afternoon, watching as a crew installed the final pieces of the playset. Miguel laughed, a sound that felt more natural than it had in years. "I don't know about that," he said. "Well, you're making people happy," she said matter-of-factly. "That's what Santa does." Miguel paused, considering her words. For so long, his success had been measured in numbers, bank balances, investment returns, profit margins. But here, in this small community, he was learning a new kind of success, one measured in smiles, laughter, and the simple joy of making life better for others. As the renovations neared completion, Miguel turned his attention to another idea. He approached Mrs. Alvarez and Chris, asking them to help him organize a meeting with the other residents. A week later, they gathered in the newly refurbished lounge. The space, once drab and uninviting, was now warm and welcoming, with comfortable seating and cheerful decor. Miguel stood at the front of the room, feeling a mix of nerves and determination. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice steady but sincere. "Over the past few weeks, I've had the chance to get to know many of you. And it's made me realize how much this community means, not just to me, but to everyone who calls this building home." He paused, looking around the room. The faces before him were attentive, curious, and, in some cases, touched by his words. "I want to propose something," Miguel continued. "A fund for residents who might need help during difficult times. It could cover emergencies, like a medical bill or an unexpected expense. I'll provide the initial funding, but I hope it will grow over time, with contributions from anyone who's able." The room was silent for a moment, then Chris spoke up. "That's an incredible idea," he said, his voice filled with admiration. Mrs. Alvarez nodded, her eyes glistening. "It's exactly what this building needs," she said. The others began to murmur their agreement, and Miguel felt a swell of emotion he hadn't anticipated. This was more than a project or a gesture. It was a way to ensure that the kindness he had experienced would continue to ripple outward, touching lives in ways he couldn't even imagine. That night, as Miguel returned to his apartment, he felt a profound sense of fulfillment. His accounts were restored, his finances secure, but those things no longer defined him. He had found something richer, a sense of purpose, a connection to others, and the realization that true wealth came not from what he owned, but from what he could give. For the first time in years, Miguel felt truly at peace. The buzz of activity in the building was unlike anything Miguel had seen before. Neighbors were coming together in ways that felt almost magical, fueled by the renovations that had transformed their shared spaces and by the spirit of connection that had begun to permeate the building. The once sterile courtyard now teemed with life, children laughing as they climbed the new play structure, adults gathered on the freshly installed benches, chatting as they sipped coffee or shared snacks. Miguel watched from the sidelines for a moment, taking it all in. It had been weeks since the work began, but he still found it hard to believe how much the atmosphere had changed. The transformation wasn't just physical, it was emotional, almost spiritual. The building felt alive, in a way it never had before. His thoughts were interrupted by Emma's familiar voice. "Miguel," she called out, waving enthusiastically as she ran toward him. "Did you see the flowers Mrs. Alvarez planted? They're so pretty." Miguel smiled, allowing her excitement to pull him from his reverie. "I did see them," he said. "She's got quite the green thumb, doesn't she?" Emma nodded vigorously. "She said she's going to teach me how to take care of them. Do you think I'll be good at it?" "I think you'll be great at it," Miguel said, his tone warm. Emma beamed before darting off to join her friends. Miguel watched her go, marveling at how something as simple as a new playground could bring so much joy. Later that afternoon, Miguel found himself in the newly refurbished lounge, meeting with Chris and Mrs. Alvarez to finalize plans for the emergency fund he had proposed. The idea had been met with overwhelming enthusiasm from the residents, and many had already pledged small contributions to ensure its sustainability. "This is shaping up nicely," Chris said, tapping a pen against the notebook in front of him. "We've already got a decent starting pool, thanks to your initial funding. Now we just need to iron out the details, how to apply for help, who reviews the requests, that kind of thing." Miguel nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I want to make sure it's simple. No red tape, no bureaucracy. People should feel comfortable asking for help when they need it." Mrs. Alvarez smiled approvingly. "That's the right approach. Sometimes, just knowing there's a safety net can make all the difference." The three of them worked through the logistics, sketching out guidelines and brainstorming ways to ensure transparency and fairness. It was a collaborative process, and Miguel found himself genuinely enjoying the exchange of ideas. It felt good to build something with others, something that had the potential to make a real impact. By the time they wrapped up, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow through the lounge's large windows. Chris leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms. "I think we've got a solid plan," he said. "This is going to help a lot of people." Mrs. Alvarez nodded, her smile tinged with emotion. "You've done something truly special here, Miguel. Not just with the fund, but with everything. This building feels like a home now. A real community." Miguel felt a lump form in his throat, but he managed a humble smile. "I couldn't have done it without all of you." As the evening set in, the building held another impromptu gathering, this time in the courtyard. Miguel joined the group, blending in more naturally than he ever thought possible. He moved between conversations, catching up with neighbors and listening to their stories. One resident, a single mother named Karen, approached him with her young son. "I just wanted to thank you," she said, her voice sincere. "The new playground has been such a blessing. I can't tell you how much it means to us." Miguel shook his head modestly. "You don't have to thank me. It was something the building needed." Karen smiled, her eyes glistening. "Maybe. But you're the one who made it happen. And it's not just the playground, it's everything. The fund, the renovations, the way people are coming together. You've given us more than you realize." Her words stayed with him as the evening wore on. He had set out to give back to the community, but in doing so, he had found something unexpected, a sense of belonging, of purpose, that money alone had never provided. As the night grew quieter, Miguel found himself sitting on one of the new benches in the courtyard, watching the lights twinkle above him. He wasn't alone for long. Chris and Mrs. Alvarez joined him, each carrying a cup of hot chocolate. "You've been quiet tonight," Chris said, handing Miguel a cup. Miguel took it with a nod of thanks. "Just thinking," he said. "Good thoughts, I hope," Mrs. Alvarez said, her tone gently teasing. "Very good," Miguel said, his voice reflective. "I've spent so much of my life chasing things, money, status, recognition. And now that I have all of that back, it doesn't seem as important anymore." Chris leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "Funny how that works, isn't it? You spend years thinking you know what matters, and then life throws you a curveball, and suddenly everything looks different." Mrs. Alvarez nodded. "It's not the money or the success that makes life meaningful. It's what you do with it. And Miguel, you've done something incredible." Miguel looked at her, then at Chris, feeling a swell of gratitude for their friendship and support. "I couldn't have done any of this without you," he said. "You've taught me more in the past few weeks than I've learned in years." The three of them sat in companionable silence for a while, sipping their hot chocolate and watching the stars. When Miguel finally returned to his apartment, it no longer felt like an isolated fortress. Instead, it felt like a part of something bigger, a piece of a community he had once ignored but now cherished. That he stood by the window, looking out at the courtyard below. The lights from the newly installed lanterns cast a warm glow, and he could still hear faint traces of laughter and conversation drifting up through the night air. For the first time in years, Miguel didn't feel the weight of loneliness. He didn't feel the need to prove himself or protect his image. Instead, he felt a quiet, enduring contentment, the kind that comes not from what you have, but from what you share. And as he stood there, watching the life of the building unfold beneath him, Miguel knew he had found something far greater than wealth or success. He had found a home. The dawn of a new year brought with it a crisp sense of renewal. Miguel stood by his window, watching as the first rays of sunlight bathed the city in a soft golden light. The world outside seemed to shimmer with possibility, and for the first time in years, Miguel felt at peace. The building was quiet in the early hours, the faint hum of the heater and the occasional creak of the floorboards the only sounds in his apartment. But the stillness no longer felt heavy or isolating. It felt like a moment to reflect, to take stock of the journey that had brought him to this place. Miguel dressed warmly and stepped out into the hallway, his footsteps echoing softly on the polished floors. The remnants of holiday decorations still adorned the building, though the garlands were beginning to droop and the lights had lost some of their brilliance. Yet the spirit of the season lingered, a testament to the changes that had taken root. As he made his way toward the lounge, he passed several neighbors who greeted him warmly. The once guarded glances and polite nods had been replaced by genuine smiles and heartfelt exchanges. Miguel stopped to chat briefly with a few of them, marveling at how natural it felt to engage, to connect. The lounge was bustling with activity when Miguel arrived. A group of residents had gathered to celebrate the first day of the year, sharing pastries and coffee over easy conversation. Children darted between the tables, their laughter filling the space with life. Chris spotted him first and waved him over. "Miguel. Just in time. We were starting to think you'd sleep through the new year." Miguel chuckled as he joined the group. "Not a chance. I wouldn't miss this." Mrs. Alvarez handed him a steaming cup of coffee, her smile as warm as the drink. "Happy New Year, dear," she said. "Happy New Year," Miguel replied, his voice sincere. The morning unfolded in a series of small but meaningful moments. Miguel listened as his neighbors shared their hopes and goals for the year ahead, their optimism infectious. He found himself joining in, speaking openly about his plans to continue supporting the building's community and exploring new ways to give back. "I've realized," he said, addressing the group, "that the most important thing I can do with my resources is to invest in people, in all of you. You've taught me what it means to belong, and I want to make sure everyone here feels that same sense of connection." The room erupted in applause, and Miguel felt a flush of emotion he hadn't expected. The approval and gratitude of his neighbors meant more to him than any accolade or business achievement ever had. Later in the afternoon, Miguel took a walk through the courtyard. The air was brisk, the bare branches of the trees casting delicate shadows on the ground. He paused near the playground, watching as Emma and a few other children played on the swings and climbed the slide. Emma spotted him and waved enthusiastically. "Miguel. Come push me on the swing. He hesitated for a moment, then smiled and approached. All right, he said, taking hold of the swing's chains. Hold on tight. Emma giggled as he gave her a gentle push, her laughter ringing out as she soared higher. See? I told you you're like Santa, she called back to him. Miguel laughed, shaking his head. I think you're giving me too much credit, Emma. No, I'm not, she insisted, her voice firm. You make people happy. That's what Santa does. Her words stayed with him as he continued his walk, her innocent perspective illuminating something he hadn't fully grasped before. In giving to others, Miguel had found a happiness he hadn't known he was missing. That evening, the residents gathered for a New Year's dinner in the lounge, the event a final celebration of the holiday season and the beginning of a new chapter. The room was alive with warmth and camaraderie, the tables laden with dishes contributed by neighbors from all walks of life. Miguel took his place among them, feeling not like an outsider observing from the edges but as a part of the fabric that made this community strong. During the meal, Chris stood to make a toast. To new beginnings, he said, raising his glass. And to Miguel, who's shown us what it means to truly care for one another. The room erupted in cheers and applause, and Miguel felt a lump form in his throat. He stood as well, holding up his glass. To all of you, he said, his voice steady but emotional. For reminding me of what really matters. You've given me more than I could ever repay. As the glasses clinked and the celebration continued, Miguel felt a sense of belonging that was deeper and more profound than anything he had ever experienced. That night, as he returned to his apartment, Miguel paused by the window, looking out at the city skyline. The lights of Dallas twinkled in the distance, but his focus was closer, on the courtyard below, on the warmth of the building that had become his home. For years, he had measured his worth by his financial success, his ability to stand apart and above. But now, he understood that true wealth was found in connection, in the simple yet powerful act of being there for others. As he stood there, the memories of the past weeks played in his mind, the loss, the humbling realizations, the kindness of his neighbors, and the joy of giving back. It was a journey he hadn't anticipated, but one he was deeply grateful for. Miguel turned away from the window and settled into his chair, a quiet smile on his face. The walls of his apartment no longer felt like barriers. They were simply part of a larger whole, a community he was proud to belong to, and as he sat there, the faint sounds of laughter and conversation drifting up from the courtyard, Miguel felt ready to embrace the future, not as the man he had been, but as the man he was becoming. For the first time in his life, Miguel Parker understood the true meaning of wealth. And it had nothing to do with money. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your favorite part in the comments below. Your support means so much to us. See you in the next video.